In the meanwhile, took place the Battle of Waterloo, in consequence of which Napoleon definitely abdicated in favor of his son, and a provisional government commission entered into functions. After Louis XVIII returned to Paris, Joachim, who until then had been protected by the imperial authorities, found himself placed in a most critical position. He was forced to quit the retreat where he had passed 6 weeks without being interfered with, exposed to danger by murderers who were seeking for him to kill him. He dared not go out to change his refuge except in the night, fearing if he were taken to have to submit to the fate of the unfortunate Marshal Brune. Murat had spread the report that he had escaped to Tunis, but his persecutors did not long remain the dupes of this strategy. The Marquis de Rivière, the same who had been condemned to death for his cooperation in George's conspiracy and whose pardon Murat had obtained, wrote to him and advised him to surrender into his hands. Monsieur de Rivière exhorted Joachim to trust to the humanity and good faith of the King of France, as well as to the word of Lord Exmouth, who associated himself in this application. The letter which I have just spoken of was handed to King Joachim by Monsieur Leclerc, General Commissary Police, who knew Murat's hiding place and who refused to reveal it. His refusal to become an instrument of treachery procured this honorable man's dismissal from his post. Joachim, having declined Marquis de Rivière's offer, as he might be expected to do, would not have any more confidence in Admiral Exmouth, who had previously refused him an asylum on board his fleet whilst awaiting the decisions of the Allied powers about him. Unable to find any safety in France, made up his mind to go to Havre and proceed thence to Corsica. With this purpose in view, Duke de Rocca-Romana freighted a vessel and embarked for this port with Colonel Boniface and 2 of the king's servants, and they were charged with his money and his clothes. As soon as they were on board, they were to send a boat to a distant point in the Bay of Toulon, where the king would hold himself in readiness to embark. Unfortunately, the boat went out of its way, and after having searched for the king in vain, returned to the ship without having found him. The murderers, who had heard of this plan of escape and who thought that Joachim had gone in the boat, boarded the vessels, and, unable to find the men whom they were looking for, obliged the captain to hoist sail forthwith. The king left his hiding place after nightfall and tried to find the boat, but as he was in ignorance of the mistake which had occurred, passed the night in the most anxious waiting. As soon as the day broke, he ran along the shore, climbing up every eminence to try to discover the vessel which meant freedom for him. He at last saw it under sail, but was unable to find any means of drawing attention to himself. Each moment removed the ship further and further away from his eyes until at last he lost sight of it altogether, heartbroken. With this new misfortune, Murat did not know what was to become of him. Fortunately, however, in the midst of his misfortunes, he did not return to the asylum which he had left, and it was well he did not do so, for he would have fallen into the hands of his persecutors, who, not having found him on board the vessel, hoped to lay hands upon him in this retreat. The wretched man walked, as chance guided his steps, avoiding the neighborhood of the ports and big buildings, and wandered thus for several days and nights through the woods and the vineyards. Finding barely enough to eat, worn out by fatigue, urged on by hunger, the unhappy proscript ventured to enter a farm. He only found an old woman there, and introducing himself to her as an officer of the Toulon garrison, who had lost his way, asked her to give him something to eat. The good woman, receiving him with cordiality, told him that in the absence of her master, who had gone out for a walk, she would make him an omelet. Whilst she was busying herself in preparing it, the master of the house returned. Seeing a stranger sitting at his table, he asked for another omelet and sat down by the side of his guest to share this modest repast with him. The resemblance between the stranger and the portrait of the King of Naples, which he had seen in the imperial hall of the Tuileries Palace, struck the newcomer. He told the king so, and Murat confessed who he was. This excellent man then rose with tears in his eyes, begging the king to forgive him for the liberty with which he had acted towards him, and placed himself and everything he possessed at his entire disposal. The good wife, troubled by this sudden recognition, hearing what her master said, was seized with a fit of nervous trembling and dropped the omelet which she held in her hand. The king remained hidden in this house for several days, whilst its owner, who was a naval officer, busied himself in conjunction with some friends whom he had taken into the secret with the best ways of providing for the subsistence and wants of his illustrious guest. In the meanwhile, the king's enemies, excited by the hope of getting hold of the gold and diamonds, which they believed he carried with him, had been hunting for him with renewed activity. The old woman who was charged to guard King Joachim discharged this duty with indefatigable perseverance. She watched all night whilst he was asleep, sitting at the window of the house, which was situated on an eminence from which she could see all that was going on around. During the night of August 13th, a gang of about 60 men came up the path, which led to the house where Murat was hiding. But the vigilant old woman saw them by the light of a lantern which they were carrying. Suspecting their evil purpose, she hastened to waken the king and told him of the danger which he was running. Joachim was sleeping in his clothes, his dagger and 2 pairs of pistols besides him. He covered himself with all speed with a great frock coat, under which he hid his arms. And then this intrepid paladin, this fearless knight who so many a time had confronted death at the wars, was forced to hide himself under the foliage of a vine, which was situated less than 30 paces from his refuge. Barely had he got out of the house when it was surrounded. The old woman had shut the door to get rid of the mattress on which the king had been sleeping and put everything in order in his room. She kept the brigands waiting outside the door, pretending that she had to dress herself. As soon as she had opened the door, they rushed into the house, searching everywhere, while some of them explored the garden and the vineyards, passing and repassing many times near the spot where the king was hidden, vomiting forth imprecations against him, expressing their hopes of finding him, of taking him alive, or of killing him, and of sharing his spoils. Joachim's mind was fully made up in case he were discovered to rush upon his murderers and sell his life dearly. And rather than fall into their hands, to blow his brains out with his own hands. Having escaped from this danger, he returned to the house because he thought, as it had been searched through and through, he would be safer there than anywhere else. His faithful host had given it up to him and had gone to sleep in the city so as to divert attention from it. The unfortunate Joachim had addressed himself to the authorities of the department to ask for their protection, assuring them of his firm resolution not to trouble public repose either by words or by acts. At the same time, he wrote to Louis XVIII, appealing to his generosity and his magnanimity, but he received no answer to his letter. Tired at last with uselessly waiting a message from the Allies under whose protection he pressingly demanded to place himself, he began to despair of ever receiving it. It was impossible for him to remain in hiding any longer. A price had been placed on his person, or rather on his head. 24,000 francs reward was offered to the man who should give him up. That meant the sale of his life, because it was all very well known that he would not be taken alive. In this terrible position, he did not know what would become of him. There was no chance of safety for him in a journey by land, and it was too late to go and join the Duke of Rocca-Romana and his nephew at Havre. Corsica was the only country which could offer him an asylum. The adventurous character of the inhabitants of this island, with their mountains and the thick jungles in their woods, offered him a safe retreat until the day when the intentions of the Allies, with reference to his person, would be known to him. It was accordingly decided upon that the king and his host should make an attempt to reach Corsica in an open boat. The king's host offered himself to conduct this expedition with the assistance of his friends. On August 22nd, Joachim wrote to Fouché to inform him of his plan, and on the evening of the same day, he embarked at Toulon with his 3 friends. On the 24th, a violent storm broke out. The fragile boat kept filling with water, which they were forced to bail out with their hats. In the afternoon, seeing a ship sailing in an opposite direction, they approached it and asked to be taken on board, offering the captain a sum of money to take them to Bastia. The captain of this ship, which was freighted with wines for Toulon, alarmed at being thus accosted by 4 men who were heavily armed, and whom he suspected of having evil designs, not only refused their offer, but did his best to sink their boat, and probably would have succeeded in doing so but for the coolness and the skill of the king and his companions, who, thanks to their presence of mind, were enabled to escape this danger. Under the first impulses of their indignation, they wanted to board the ship and revenge themselves on the ill-conditioned crew. But on reflection, however, they abandoned this plan. A few minutes later, the king and his friends were fortunate enough to fall in with the packet, which plied regularly between Toulon and Bastia. It was in the nick of time, for it would have been no longer possible for them to keep afloat. Their boat had been seriously damaged by the storm, and in the course of the encounter which they had engaged in against the trading vessel, the king met several eminent people on board the packet boat to whom he was known and who were leaving the south of France from motives of prudence. Murat spent a day at Bastia, and on the morrow proceeded with his 3 comrades to Vescovato, which is a big village 15 miles to the south of Bastia. He went straight up to the biggest house, which belonged to Monsieur de Colonna Sicaldi, mayor of this village, who was a warm partisan of the Bourbons, for whose cause he had endured many years of exile. Monsieur Sicaldi enjoyed a well-merited reputation for brightness and generosity in the country. The king disclosed himself to him, informing him of the reasons which obliged him to seek refuge in Corsica, and begged him to grant his hospitality until it would be possible for him to know the decision of the allied sovereigns with reference to him. Monsieur Colonna Sicaldi received King Joachim with respect and assured him that the laws of hospitality were sacred to the Corsicans. He added that no order emanating from the government obliged the subjects of the King of France to treat a Frenchman who had been sovereign in Naples as an enemy. The king had the greatest satisfaction in meeting one of his aides de camp in this house, an officer named Francischetti, who had retired there quite recently with his wife, Monsieur de Sicaldi's daughter. In the meanwhile, the commander of the town of Bastia, having heard of King Joachim's presence in Corsica, sent him orders to consider himself a prisoner until the King of France's decision concerning him should be made known. Murat refused to obey the orders of an officer in whom he recognized no authority whatever over his person. The military commander of Bastia then declared Joachim the enemy of Louis XVIII and a perturbator of the public peace. He sent some 100 soldiers to Vescovato to capture him, but in the meanwhile, Monsieur Sicaldi's friends and relations had united to repel this attempt at violence, for they considered it their bounden duty and a point of honor to assist in defending their host's glorious guest, who had placed himself under the protection of their hospitality. To this force, which in the course of a few days had reached the number of over 600 men who had hastened from every point in the island, 200 more men, veterans or the most part officers who had formerly served under the king's orders, who had come back home after the fall of the empire, added themselves. The soldiers who had been sent from Bastia might consider themselves very lucky to be able to return without injury. The men who had helped King Joachim urged him to seize upon Bastia and even the whole of the island, promising him the assistance of the troops and of the greater part of the inhabitants. Murat thanked these good people for their zeal, but had no hesitation in saying that he considered himself a fugitive who had come to Corsica in search of hospitality alone and had no right to make any attempt against the sovereignty of King Louis XVIII. 3 weeks having passed by without his having received any answer whatever to his letters from the Allies, which made him suppose that he was abandoned and proscribed by the European powers, and persuaded that there was no other resource for him than to listen to the promptings of his despair, he took the resolution to endeavor to win back his crown by conquest, even were he to find death in the adventure. To avoid coming to blows with the superior commander of Bastia, Murat left Vescovato. He accepted the services of 400 men selected amongst the braves who had offered him their help, and proceeded with them to Ajaccio. On his approach, the authorities of the town retired, with the exception of the mayor, who remained behind to protect public peace. The inhabitants received King Joachim with respect, and his troops behaved with absolute discipline. The king refused the hospitality which was offered to him in private houses so as to compromise nobody, and went to live in an inn. It was there that he arranged for the purchase of 5 ships and collected the arms and ammunition necessary for his expedition. These preparations lasted several days. Whilst the adventures of which we have spoken were taking place, one of King Joachim's aides-de-camp of British origin, Captain Masseron, who happened to be in Paris for reasons which I have have nothing to do with the story, and from whose book I have already taken a great part of these particulars, and who was busying himself to be useful to King Murat, knowing Fouché's former relations with his dethroned king, had approached this minister who made use of his service with the Duke of Wellington, at a time when the Duke of Otranto was secretly trading with the English general. Masteron, having taken advantage of his relations with Lord Wellington, had implored the latter's aid to obtain from Monsieur de Metternich the promise of a refuge in Austria for King Joachim, and he had succeeded in his application, as will be seen by reading the following document. Monsieur Masteron is authorized by these presents to inform King Joachim that His Majesty the Emperor of Austria will grant him an asylum in his states under the following conditions. 1. The king will take the name of a private person. The queen having assumed the name of Lipona, it is proposed that the king should do so also. 2. The king will be at liberty to select a town in Bohemia, Moravia, or in Upper Austria, and to take up his abode there. Should he wish to settle in the country, there would be no objection to his doing so in the same provinces. 3. The king will give his word in honor to his imperial and royal majesty not to leave the Austrian states without the express sanction of his said majesty, that he will live as a distinguished private person who is subject to the laws in force in the Austrian states, in favor of which, and in order that suitable use may be made of it, to the undersigned has received the imperial orders to sign the present declaration, given in Paris on September 1st, 1815. Signed, Metternich. Provided with this declaration and with passports, Masteron proceeded to Toulon, where he heard that King Murat had left for Corsica. Thereupon, Captain Masteron, being anxious to carry out his mission successfully, embarked for Bastia. In this port, he had an interview with the English Captain Bastard, who was in command of the Meander, a frigate of the British Navy. This officer, having informed him of King Joachim's preparations and of the expedition which he was preparing, did not conceal from Masteron that there was a great excitement in Naples, but that necessary arrangements were being made to repel this audacious attack. The commander of the English vessel declared at the same time that he'd received orders to oppose Murat's adventurous enterprise by force, and that he should make his arrangements so as to capture the king's flotilla after he had left port and was at some distance from the boat. Before leaving Bastia himself, Masteron received a visit from 2 Corsicans there who had come from Leghorn on the Meander. One of them was a captain of the Royal Corsican Regiment in British service. The other was a civil servant in the new government of the new King of Naples. These emissaries carried orders from the Neapolitan minister, who enjoined upon them to resist King Joachim's expedition by every means in their power. Like Captain Bastard, they thought that having seen Monsieur Masteron, Murat would accept the refuge offered him by the Emperor of Austria. Masteron arrived in Ajaccio on September 28th, bringing 2 servants who had been in the service with money, linen, and clothes. In spite of the affectionate cordiality with which the king received Masteron, he refused to listen to his advice. The captain in vain urged him in the most pressing way to make up his mind to accept the offers of hospitality from the Austrian government. He had given orders that Joachim should be received at Trieste, whither he would be transported by an English vessel. The king answered that it was too late, that the die was cast, that he had already waited for the decision of the Allied powers for a space of 3 months, during which his time had been constantly menaced, that finally, persecuted as he was by the sovereigns of Europe, he had made up his mind to risk all and to endeavor to recover the throne which he had lost. King Murat further added that in spite of all the confidence in his success with which he was animated, he cared very little for the result of his expedition. If he failed in his enterprise, he would at least leave the comfort of losing his life after having so often confronted death on so many fields of battle. He also said that the failure of his campaign against Austria could not deprive him of his right as a king, which had been acknowledged by the whole of Europe and that he had signed no abdication. The final reason which urged him to persevere in his determination to vindicate his rights to the crown was that in acting otherwise he would have gratuitously compromised 300 brave officers and soldiers who had wished to follow him and whom it was impossible to abandon to the revenge of the French royal government. Captain Masteron, despairing of turning King Joachim away from this foolhardy enterprise, begged him at least for a written answer to the proposal which he had been commissioned to lay before him. The king, who did not wish to make his plans public, yet informed Captain Masteron in a letter that he accepted the passport which had been sent him, that he intended to make use of it to proceed to the destination which was mentioned upon it. But subsequently, on the night which preceded his departure, King Murat addressed another letter to Masteron, in which he admitted that his first communication had been dictated to him by the necessity imposed upon him of hiding his true designs, and that he owed it to truth, to his own dignity, and to the noble frankness and good faith of the captain to acquaint him at last with his real intentions. This very long letter, in which King Joachim bitterly complained of the way in which the Allied forces had treated him, terminated with the declaration that he was leaving to go and reconquer his kingdom, and that he would already be some distance on his way at the time when Captain Masteron should receive his letter.